Welcome, everybody, and happy Friday. While we wait for people to file in, we are so happy to see you here today. Please feel free to write your name and where you're calling in from, um, and what organization you're with, and maybe what even species you might be working on. We'd love to hear it and see who's here today. We'll just give it another minute while people file in. And while we wait for some people to file in, we have simultaneous translation available. So feel free to follow the directions in the chat. It's nice to see some familiar faces here today. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. All right. With that, let's get started. Happy Friday, everybody. While we're waiting for people to join, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling from, your organization, and which species you might be working on. Greetings. My name is Amy Gambrill. I'm the Executive Director of Road to Recovery, and welcome to our July Species Working Group webinar series, where we spotlight and highlight the work of R2R species working groups. We've been hosting these webinars for a few years now. We try to foster collaboration and discussion across working groups and advance our cause of recovering tipping point species. We are glad to have you here today, and we hope you'll join us every second Friday of the month throughout the year. You can sign up on our website. So let's start with a little bit of housekeeping. We offer simultaneous translation in Spanish, and we have directions in the chat. So please pick your language there. And also consider subscribing to our monthly newsletter. It's called The Perch, where we highlight species working groups, new tools, and spotlight the great people of bird population recovery as well. You can go to our website, r2rbirds.org, to subscribe there. And we'll be hosting an international workshop at the National Conservation Training Center, NCTC, again in West Virginia in January 2027. So the registration link should be going up in the chat. It's also on our website. We'd love to see you there and really get to know you and work on the issues of the day. Lastly, if you would like to highlight the work of a species working group in one of these webinars, or some innovative science that would help other tipping point species recovery efforts, please send us an email. It's r2r@georgetown.edu. We'd love to hear from you. So now over to R2R's graduate fellow, Laura Ibarra. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Amy. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. We're really excited to welcome the American Oystercatcher Working Group to Road to Recovery's July webinar. Today, we will learn about the history of this collaborative partnership, its major accomplishments, and its goals for advancing the conservation of the American oystercatcher across its range. So, through today's webinar, you will hear how coordinated research, long-term monitoring, and strong partnerships among researchers, conservation organizations, and management agencies have contributed to the conservation of this iconic shorebird. Our speaker will also share the working group's priorities and vision for the future. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lindsay Addison. Lindsay Addison has been Audubon, North Carolina's coastal biologist since 2011. In this role, Lindsay and the staff members she supervises manage and monitor about 40% of the water birds that nest on North Carolina's coast. She serves on the American Oystercatcher Working Group's steering committee, coordinates North Carolina statewide oystercatcher banding program, and collaborates with academic and agency partners on science and monitoring projects. Lindsay earned her undergraduate degree at Stetson University and her MS at Florida Gulf Coast University, where she studied lizards nesting on natural beaches and rooftops. She has worked in bird conservation since 2005 in Florida, Massachusetts, and California, and it's grateful to have been born and raised in Southwest Florida. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Lindsay, to share today's presentation with us. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for all of the background work you did shepherding me through the process of getting signed up and ready to give this presentation. So really appreciate that, and thanks for offering this in English and Spanish. So I'm here, as myself representing the American Oystercatcher Working Group and its steering committee. And so anything that I say, is subject to correction by the other members of the working group who are listening in on this call as well. So I hope I do a good job. And I'll just dive right in with sort of just a quick introduction to the American oystercatcher. So we have got 5 different subspecies, and the one that the American Oystercatcher Working Group focuses on is Hematopus palliatus palliatus, which is found nesting from Nova Scotia down all the way into Mexico, and then it winters from New Jersey in the United States all the way down actually into Central America, which is information that we know thanks to Salvador Morales, who is on this call. She and her colleagues started finding our banded birds down there, and we became very excited about that. They eat what it sounds like they eat. So they're a bivalve specialist, particularly on oysters, but other things like blue mussels in the Northeast, or razor clams, ribbed mussels in the Southeast. And they are, like most shorebirds, they're territorial during the breeding season. They just want them and their mate on the territory. And then they become quite social, congregate in large flocks during the non-breeding season. And the thing that I think they've been known for, and particularly maybe in the last year or so, has been the fact that unlike a lot of shorebirds, their population trajectory is actually going up, at least in the United States. And so this is kind of the oyster catchers and the working groups, claim to fame, such as it is, which is that beginning in the late aughts, so the early 2000s, they became the focus of a lot of conservation effort that turned a downward population trajectory into an upward population trajectory. And this was due to a lot of hard work, not only in management, but also in monitoring, so we could detect this change. And this has been the work of the American Oystercatcher Working Group. And so I kind of, with this graph in mind, I'd like to sort of introduce you to the history of the working group so you can kind of understand how we came to be and what we do. And I will say, if there's anything that I'm not saying clearly or that I need to stop and do a better job of, so people can feel free to unmute and interrupt, if Laura, if you want to help with that. I can't monitor the chat at the same time. But anyway, so the American Oystercatcher Working Group, hang on, where's my little, the American oystercatcher was first kind of identified as a species of concern around the year 2000, and it's for all of the reasons that you typically hear, whether human disturbance, depredation by overabundant predators, and habitat loss. So this is a common problem with coastal birds, many different species, least terns, Wilson's plovers. They all have to deal with this, and especially, in coastal areas, you have a lot of competition between people for recreational habitat and birds for survival habitat, whether it's, wintering, foraging, winter roosting, or nesting habitat in the spring and summer months. So they were identified as a species of concern. And the idea was that something should be done. So conversations were held. This is before my time, and the first working group meeting was held in South Carolina in 2001. So the idea was that a bunch of people would get together and try to figure out what to do about it. And the folks that attended these meetings, it was a lot of site managers, so a lot of kind of what they call on the ground practitioners, biologists, technicians, folks that were working directly with the species at sites throughout their breeding and wintering range. And those early meetings focused a lot on the site managers sharing what was happening at their sites, talking about the challenges that they were experiencing. And it also focused a lot on coordinating management and monitoring work, including the management work that would guide the the surveys that would allow us to monitor their population trend from being low to increasing 45%. Another thing that the working group focused on early and has continued to support has been range-wide coordinated banding. So we've been putting out field-readable bands on oyster catchers since the early 2000s. And in 2004, based on those very early efforts, the group came up with a coordinated banding scheme, and everybody agreed that they would band within that scheme. So colors of bands were assigned to states. Some letters of the alphabet were excluded because they were difficult to read or could be confused with numbers. And we have been banding oyster catchers in a coordinated fashion ever since. Another thing that the group has worked on and continues to focus on has been standardizing the metrics that we collect. So I am sure, and I started with the working group in 2011, so this is right before my time, but I'm sure there were many long conversations, and Pam, who's on this call, can probably speak to that. But I'm sure there were many long and tortured conversations. But one of the funny things about collecting data is that even if you think that you're collecting the same information, there's small nuances or little differences that make what you're collecting not quite the same as what another group may be collecting. So the working group came up with sort of these reproductive output metrics. So productivity, which we defined as the number of fledglings produced per breeding pair within a particular site, what nest survival was, what fledging was, how old did a chick have to be considered fledged, because you don't necessarily see every bird that fledges actually fly, what a breeding pair is defined as, what a territorial pair is defined as. So we came up with these standardized metrics, and we've been continuing to work on having standardized metrics ever since. Other things that the group put a lot of effort into is the Birds of North America account. So if you're familiar with Cornell, they have this really nice series. It's now Birds of the World. It started off as Birds of North America. And that is, basically these really detailed species accounts. And there was a oystercatcher species account that was led by Erica Knoll, who's kind of the grandmother of American oystercatcher research. And it had been published over 10 years ago in 2012. And so the working group wanted to update it, and Cornell was going through the process of updating. And so instead of having, I think it might be the only species account, I don't know for sure. At the time the update was authored not by a group of individual names, but it says when you go and you look at the citation, American Oystercatcher Working Group. So people volunteered to review and update all of the different sections, but it was a collective effort, and that was reflected in the authorship of the species account. And that just kind of tells you a little bit about sort of the ethos or the approach that the working group has towards what we want to do together. The other thing that we launched in 2012 was the American Oystercatcher Band Database, which was this big effort to get all of the capture data and all of the banding data into one place. Individual permit holders or kind of a lead person within each state would be collecting re-sightings in an Excel spreadsheet, and all of that got put in one place. It got cleaned up, and a database was made, and that database still exists today. And now, jumping ahead, the working group had been meeting annually ever since its founding in 2001. With the pandemic, we had our first remote meeting, and ever since we've been offering the first 2020 and 2021 were fully remote. There was no in-person option. But ever since we started meeting in person again, we have offered a remote attendance option, and that's more than doubled the people who are able to come. It's made our meetings more accessible because you don't have to pay for travel. So that was a big deal for us. We also have the productivity protocol that was launched in 2022. And we took sort of those breeding outputs, so sort of the summary metrics, and we wanted to make sure not only that we were using the same summary metrics, but that the definitions of all of the things and sort of the way that the data was being collected had a chance to be standardized as well. So we developed a productivity protocol. It was sort of modeled on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's piping plover protocol. And we launched that in 2022. And then we also launched in 2024 a habitat restoration database, which is a collection of all different types of restoration, creation, enhancement projects that benefit oyster catchers. Oyster catchers don't have to be the primary intended beneficiary, but the project should just have something to do, the potential to benefit oyster catchers. And the idea was it's very expensive to do habitat restoration often. It involves a lot of different partners. It might involve a lot of different reasons for doing the work. Maybe it's actually more about improving navigation or some other species benefit besides oyster catchers. But because of the cost and the complexity of these things, you don't want to screw it up if you get it wrong. So we wanted people to be able to learn from others' experiences. So we wanted to gather what folks had learned in the working group. And you can go to this map, you could scroll around and look at the locations of different projects, click on them, filter by different attributes. And so we're trying to make it easier for people kind of to learn how other groups that have gone before succeeded or maybe failed a little bit, but we want people to learn from others' experiences. So those are just some of the things that we've worked on over the past 25, almost 26 years. At the same time as all this stuff was going on in the working group, there were also these recovery initiatives being launched. And this is with the support of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NFWF. And the idea was that you would write a business plan, not for a for-profit business, but for the conservation of a species, in this case, the American oystercatcher. And the idea was that if you invested in targeted conservation management strategies, your return on investment, which would be the number of birds, would be realized. And so this document, you can find it on our website or Google it, but it's kind of, at the time, I think it was kind of a little bit of a different spin on conservation, a different way of approaching conservation. So this was a real landmark thing for us. And then the success of that was rolled up into the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative, which was launched in 2015. It's specifically about the business plan for the conservation of the American oystercatchers. The idea was that NFWF would fund applied management and research for a period of time, that work would be focused on, growing the population by reducing threats that had already been identified and filling gaps in knowledge that were preventing us from moving forward with the oyster catchers recovery. And a big focus of this, and indeed all of the working group's work, has been monitoring and management and using science to understand the results of those management actions. And another big focus of the working group has been partnerships. So the working group has over 40 organizations that are members that come to meetings and participate on our listserv and contribute to our data calls. And we ask at the end of the breeding season, tell us about your productivity. How many pairs did you have? How many fledglings did they produce? People tell us. We don't have any way of making people do this. They do it because they think it's important. So they're sort of self-motivated. And so the graph at the bottom of this page here kind of shows that business plan model, where there's actually a little graph like, if you spend money, you can get things, and if you don't spend money, you probably won't get them. So this is just applied to a bird species. And so again, with the business plan, it really focused on coordinated management across states, across organizations, coordinated monitoring by those partners using consistent standards in order to achieve conservation at scale. And several years back, we did a little survey, and we wanted to look at, how many pairs and miles. And you could see we've got almost 1,000 miles of coastline, almost 1,700 pairs of oyster catchers monitored, and a wide range of partners from all different types of agencies, non-governmental agencies, and so on. So it's been a big success in sort of creating and sustaining the engagement of lots of different folks. And some of our main products that the working group has focused on producing and maintaining over the years is, number one, the banding work. And that's really what lies behind that, is a desire to understand their demographics and their population dynamics. And it's one of, I don't know of another effort that's more comprehensive than this banding effort. Basically, every state, with just a handful of exceptions due to the low number of oyster catchers nesting in them, participates in banding oyster catchers with field readable bands. And folks throughout the United States and indeed in Mexico and in Central America recite our oyster catchers. The band database is operated in coordination with the Bird Banding Lab, which is our U.S.-based permitting organization and kind of organizing partner. But the database is separate from the Bird Banding Lab. In our database, there's over 8,500 banded oyster catchers and over 122,000 recite records. So it's a really comprehensive source of information, and anybody who is a member of the working group has access to all of the records in that. It's really also unusual in the fact that we have a data sharing agreement, and everybody who's banded oyster catchers agreed to allow their information to be placed into the database, and it's available for folks for science and research, and also for outreach and education. Another big focus of the working group is coordinated monitoring and sharing that information with the other members of the group. So every year we ask for productivity summary metrics, and our goal, based on just some kind of early population modeling done, over, I think, about 15 years ago now, is to have a productivity rate across the American oyster catchers U.S. range of 0.5 fledglings produced per pair. And not every state, however, is capable of counting all of their breeding pairs. So if you want to know how many total oyster catchers exist within the U.S. population, you can't use your breeding pair numbers, because it's just too difficult to count your breeding pairs. They're just higgledy-piggledy, one here, one there. They're just not all in one place. Conveniently, in the winter, they form these big flocks. And so in order to actually count how many are in the total population, Manomet, one of our primary partners in the American Oystercatcher Working Group, led this effort to set up these range-wide winter surveys where an observer in a small plane flies the entire winter range within the U.S. from New Jersey, which is about the northern extent of their winter range, all the way down to Texas's border with Mexico. Um, the the aerial surveys are both by eye and with photographs, and then we have observers on the ground running routes as well to kind of get a detection rate for the airplane if is it missing flocks. And then we also use the photographs compared with the observers counts to get an idea of how accurate the counts within the flocks are. So we have an error bar with our population estimates. And that big blue graph that I showed you at the beginning of this PowerPoint, that's where that information comes from. And the other thing that the working group provides, in addition to the science and in addition to sort of the database and the metrics and all of that, is it provides a community of organizations and individuals working on oystercatcher conservation. For example, if you're a park ranger at a state park and you're kind of the bird ranger, you might be the only person that's dealing with predation on your oyster catchers at your site. But if you're a member of the working group, you have a peer group that understands sort of the ups and downs of your work life and some of the challenges. So you get members of the working group, especially at our meetings, but also through interactions on our listserv, can provide feedback, ideas, a shared purpose, encouragement. It's a community of people working on this particular species with these particular challenges. So that's very valuable as well. It's a group project. And the characteristics of the working group that help to facilitate that community are that we're a cooperative group, we provide coordination, but it's also a very open and informal group. Anyone can join, anyone can decide they want to try to lead a project or take something on. It's not very hierarchical. Again, it's really one of the things when we talk about it among ourselves, we really think it's critical to have engagement from site managers, from the people that are working with your focal species at sites, they're the people that are really kind of where the rubber meets the road. We've also had wonderful engagement and participation of students and academic partners throughout the life of the working group. And we've had a lot of different types of partners. We've kind of improved that beyond even what we had going on before by having the accessible meetings, the hybrid option where you could join the meeting in person or you could Zoom in. Having these shared products, having that support from NIFWF, especially in the early years, was so important. And it kind of tricked people into thinking that, oh, this is something we just do. You have a 5-year grant and you're monitoring your oyster catchers and the grant ends and you're like, well, I'm just going to keep monitoring these oyster catchers. And it also provides people with fun. Our annual meetings always have a field trip. People, if they're going to do something over a period of time, they have to get something out of it. It has to be enjoyable on some level. And so I think that's really key too. So the working group has sort of a lot of different accomplishments. I won't read them all here, but some of the things that I think are really, really cool to have is we do have a lot of best practices documents. They're available on our website, or, if you've got a particular problem, you can kind of read what the group has found to work. There's opportunities to engage on a lot of different levels, whether through boundary siting or through educational stuff. We've dabbled in community-based social marketing. We're trying to make ourselves, accessible and friendly to the public. And one of the ways we communicate with each other is in order to be a member, is you just join a listserv. So again, you don't have to pay dues or pass any tests. You just ask for your email to be added to a listserv. And then we also have all of these kind of science products and information that we're gathering and we're trying to continue to improve our data collection as we go forward. And I'll just kind of, the last thing I'll mention to pull out among this list of accomplishments is that because a lot of oyster catchers nest on beaches and in other high use coastal areas, small islands that attract boaters and so forth, if you do management to protect oyster catchers or to remove a predator that's a problem at a site, you're benefiting a lot of other coastal species, a lot of different terns, a lot of plovers, depending on where you are in the US, it might be a piping plover, it might be a Wilson's plover, but there's a lot of benefit to focusing management at sites where oyster catchers are, because they are in all different types of coastal habitats. They're not restricted to only to beaches or only to marshes. So when you monitor for an umbrella species like an oyster catcher, you get a lot of other benefits as well. One of the things that we did as a group was we sent out a questionnaire and we asked people what other species benefited from their work with oyster catchers. And we have a little summary about that on our website. So all of this work, all of this effort, was going on at the same time as the winter aerial surveys were being done. So the first one was conducted in 2003. You could see there on the bottom in the blue, and that found a little under 11,000 total oyster catchers. And again, this was kind of early 2000s, people looking at oyster catchers. It seems like there's fewer of them. We think their population's in decline. We're worried about it. So the idea was that you would do these aerial surveys at 5-year intervals. So the next one was completed in 2008. It was actually a subset of the entire coast based on the 2003 surveys, just due to, restrictions in capacity. But that survey estimated the population at just a little over 10,000. So a loss of almost 800 individuals over 5 years. So this was kind of where it definitely seemed very, very concerning. And this is where the Oyster Catcher Recovery Initiative kicked in, the funding from NIFWF kicked in, and that impetus to improve oyster catcher management or to institute oyster catcher management all around the United States coast. And lo and behold, the next aerial survey, their population had increased to a little over 11,000. And then the next aerial survey, it was still increasing. And our most recent aerial survey, conducted in 2023, found about 14,700 birds. So that's sort of the whole story. If you put it all together, this is kind of what the history of the working group and the history of the oyster catcher population looks like. And I will say this, the little pop-ups ran a little bit differently on my computer when it wasn't on Zoom. But anyway, so I wanted also to share, I've talked about our productivity metrics and that everybody, in the working group is asked to contribute their data at the end of the season. And so this is what our productivity looks like. So again, what we define as productivity is fledglings per pair. And so we've lumped all of the pairs across all of the states, and obviously more oyster catcher pairs were monitored, because once you start a working group and people like the working group, you end up with more sites being monitored. So some of the total numbers of monitored individuals went up over the course of the working group's history as more sites came on. But our fledglings per pair also increased, which is really great because it shows that it works. So we have been meeting the productivity goal most years. In the past few years, we had a dip. It's unfortunate, but this has been very heartening to see. And our most recent year, 2025, didn't make it onto that graph. So here's our 2025 data. So you could see this broken out by state. So the little gray dots are the numbers of pairs monitored in each state. And then the gray bars are the productivity. So again, that black line, would represent 0.5 fledglings per pair. And you could see that many of the states are meeting that 0.5 fledglings per pair. And we're working on understanding, or have an understanding, depending on the state, of why we're not in some of these other states. And we're able to focus our conservation and management efforts towards improving those numbers for the states that aren't meeting the goal. So what the working group is working towards doing now, our original goal, we wanted to increase the oyster catcher population in the US by 50% from 2008 levels. We're not quite there. And so we still need some help. We still need some funding. But we're hoping that when we do the next aerial survey, maybe we'll have met that 50% target. In order to maintain that population increase, we need to keep our productivity levels up at around 0.5 fledglings per pair. And in order to do that, we need to manage nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat throughout their annual cycle, winter, spring, summer, and fall. And especially during the breeding season, we need to continue our management efforts to reduce human disturbance and depredation, especially by mammalian predators. And that's work that just has to happen every year. Everyone who works with coastal birds knows if you don't manage your predators or you don't keep people from walking through your nesting areas, you're not going to be very successful. So that's kind of annual evergreen work that just has to happen every year, no ifs, ands, or buts. Another thing that we're focusing on, especially sort of in the face of sea level rise, increased erosion, more severe storms, is habitat. So particularly for marsh nesting oyster catchers, we're seeing the loss of sites, and we want to work to restore and create habitat for oyster catchers. We don't want them just to have to be on barrier islands, because barrier islands are subject to a lot of pressures, both from people and from predators, including, especially in the southeast, coyotes, which are relatively new to the coast and really change the game once they arrive on your island. In order to meet all of those management and conservation goals, we need to have a constituency of support for oyster catchers. And that's why we need to have compelling science and communication tools that help us to make the case to lawmakers, to funders, to the general public, why oyster catchers matter, why we think they're cool, and why they should think they're cool too. So leveraging the cooperative banding and the mark reciting efforts, we want to use that to develop an integrated population model, a dynamic one that can be updated every year as we get new data from our survey work, our band recitings, our productivity monitoring. Oyster catchers, as we saw in one of the early slides, don't just exist in the United States. The U.S. birds winter outside of the U.S. as well as within the U.S. And there's other subspecies in Central America and South America that have some of the same conservation challenges. So we want to expand and improve our Latin American partnerships and support our partners working in those countries as they embark on oyster catcher conservation efforts. We want to continue to make sure that we're addressing marsh erosion, sea level rise. We want to take our productivity monitoring data and put it into a database. So we will need to develop a database for that, as well as for the bands and the habitat. And then we'd also want to continue to keep our website up to date and continue to provide different resources for folks. And this is my pitch for visiting the American Oystercatcher Group website. Our address is amoywg.org. And we have a lot of different resources for folks. We've got contact information by state and country. So if you are interested in connecting with other people that are working with oyster catchers, we've got that for you. We've got the two databases that are up and running, the band database and the habitat restoration database. And we also have a lot of resources, protocols, the standardized metrics, best management practice documents, and so forth. And then I would make a pitch to come to our annual meetings. We have a Zoom option. It's very cheap to attend our annual meetings if you don't travel. And even if you do travel, we're one of the least expensive meetings you can travel to. So we've got all that information on the website. We just got it updated in time for this talk today, so we're very excited about that. And there's more resources besides. There's a blog. We're going to have an oyster catcher literature library within the next week or so up and running. So we've got a lot of stuff for people. If you're interested in oyster catchers, or if you just like to see some of the things that a working group has been doing, this is our model. This is how we've kept it together for so long, and what we think, the components that we think make it successful. So I really appreciate folks coming and listening, especially if, your bird isn't the oyster catcher. So on behalf of myself, the American Oystercatcher Working Group Steering Committee, and all of the members of the working group, a big thank you. I really appreciate it. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Lindsay, for such an amazing presentation, and congratulations on this great and fantastic work you shared with us today. So we'll now move to the Q&A session. So I think we have a couple of questions on the chat. If you have questions, please type them in the chat or raise your hand. We know that we have a few members of this working group here. So if some of you want to add anything, just raise your hands and well, you can say your comments here. But if not, we're gonna start with some of the questions that we have on the chat. I think the first one has been already answered by Pam and Deb on the chat, but we have another one by Liam Corcoran that said, did you have any funding for the creation of the website, including acquiring the domain, or was the website made by volunteers?
Ted Simons and his graduate students. So we had Ted Simons was a professor at NC State University for many years. And I think it was originally housed on NC State servers. And then we got our own domain and some hosting space. I think for a period of time, we forgot about paying the bill, and our web designer, Neil McCoy, paid for the hosting space and then was too nice to tell us that this was happening. Then we found out, and we have had so a little bit. We don't have a dedicated stream of money going, coming in, except for whatever we don't spend on the direct costs of hosting a meeting. And so we have a little bit of money that we raise every year through registrations to the meeting. And then we did use that to pay Neil to make the updates. So we do have an actual web designer, but it's been a mix of some volunteer work as well.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see if we have another question. But if not, I have some some question for you. So can you tell us more about how the American Oystercatcher Working Group's structure and priorities have been shaped by or coordinated with the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative?
I think they've really been kind of hand in glove, because a lot of the threats and limiting factors identified in that plan kind of mirror or are related to, or just exactly the same as the threats identified in the business plan for the conservation of the American oystercatcher. So I think kind of that model of, stepping, through, filling knowledge gaps, getting good monitoring information. I it From my perspective, they've kind of been they've been very similar. And then maybe the specific information that you get out of your efforts are particular to your species, like the results of our winter surveys and so forth. But I think they don't, from my perspective, like I say, they don't really seem to be different in any big fundamental way.
Okay, thank you so much. If anyone want to ask
Yeah.
something, you can put your questions on the chat. And I would like to know what's needed most to expand your Latin American partnerships.
I want some just thoughts on this because I'm not but I think some of it is funding for travel, support for travel, making it easier for us to interact. It's great to be on calls and stuff together, but spending time in person when we've had and we've used some of our limited funds to support travel from by folks from Central and South American countries to attend our meetings, and that in-person time is just really invaluable. And then I think probably funding to support time, for the folks in the countries doing the work is also critical. So I think kind of support for people doing the work within the Latin American countries, and support to help us interact in a meaningful way. And I that's just that's my perspective. I do wonder if Salvador is able to comment, or if anyone else from one of these countries has anything else to add, being aware that I'm not from them.
Yeah, if anyone wants to add something, just raise your hand. You can tell us. Okay, we have another question from the Q&A that says, American Oystercatcher business plan was the first one, and that chart that you show about how much money might produce more birds was revolutionary at the time. The key to the success is capacity, leadership, and funding. And FWF support cannot be underestimated. Well, that's a comment.
Yeah, no,
What's your
that's
comment?
absolutely true. I mean, all of this stuff takes time. Like this, I talk about like a lot of the work that we do, that the partners throughout the working group do, is it's annual management. It's being able to hire technicians, it's being able to hire people to do predator management, it's being able to hire the plane, just being able to, it's very expensive to buy that much airtime every 5 years. So, capacity. I think we kind of know what is needed. And I think in the case of the American Oystercatcher, and we kind of have an idea of where we want to, the gaps we want to fill. And it's just, finding that capacity.
Yeah, well, you have made a huge, great work about this. Um, Let me see if we have another question for you today. Looking back at the working group history since 2001, what have you learned or what will you do differently today?
For me, the biggest thing I learned, and Ted would talk about this, and you could see this in how we had a kind of a chair of the steering committee for many years, Shiloh Schulte, who tragically lost his life last year. It was just being getting along, playing well with others, being cooperative, being friendly, being open, having fun, kind of the, I know we've got some social scientists on this call. I wonder, like, I hope this doesn't sound insane to them, but I think, being the kind of group that people want to participate in because it's friendly and enjoyable. You're just not going to do stuff you don't like over a long, long period of time. People will just kind of move on to other things. So and I, um, and Ted talked about it, is having that kind of communitarian approach to things.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's like super important to have that kind of focus on doing something that is enjoyable, that people want to volunteer to be with the oyster catchers. I love oyster catchers. They're really great species,
Yeah, I
really
think
easy to
yeah,
recognize.
yeah, pick a charismatic species too. Don't pick
Yeah.
like the I don't know, the brown dirt sucker. Like nobody wants to study that. Um,
Yeah.
gotta
And talking about community, tell us more about community-based social marketing. Oh, and I have
so
another.
the working group's been involved in sort of helping to understand the impact of specific community-based social marketing campaigns on behaviors of people at the beach. So some of the key types of behaviors that we want is for people to leash their dogs when they're at the beach. If dogs, well, number one, follow the rules. If dogs aren't allowed on the beach, don't bring them on the beach. But number two, if you do have the ability to, if dogs are allowed, you need to leash it, and be aware of their impact on birds. And so kind of so we've been involved in doing some, developing campaigns, implementing campaigns, and then trying to assess the impacts of those campaigns. And that's one of the great things about the working group is, there's so many different partners all throughout the United States. Is when you say we, it's like people in about half a dozen states, did this work. We've got we have a publication in review that includes the work of Oystercatcher Working Group partners. So, So that's kind of been some of our work. And we've been active, like we've interacted, we've contributed to the AFC's websites, kind of resources of signs and sort of documents to help people communicate with the public. So, and we do have some, um, so those are the types of things that we've been doing with community-based social marketing.
Yeah, and I think some of these threads are like shared in all the American oyster catchers range, right? Like the unleashed dogs on the beach. We are seeing those here too, and I think we are seeing that kind of threats in all the hemisphere.
Yeah.
So we have another question by John DeLuca, and he says, "What are the biggest threats or opportunities for habitat conservation in Latin America?" Echoing Lindsay, it will be great to hear the perspective of people based in Latin America. So is somebody from working on oyster catchers or shorebirds here that want to share something about this? If not, we can move to another questions to have a little bit more time to think about this. And David Ramirez is asking,
Oh, there's Salvadora.
Oh, hi, Salvadora. Please go ahead.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Yo
Hi
solamente
everyone.
me perdí un poco
I
en lo que estaba en el
just
momento de la
got a little
pregunta
bit
que
lost
hizo
during the
Lindsay,
question
pero quería
raised
agregar que
by Lindsay,
hemos
but I wanted to
estado
add that we have
evaluando
been
la creación, o hemos creado un
assessing
subcomité
the creation. Actually,
como
we
un
have
capítulo
created
del
a
grupo de trabajo
subcommittee. It's
para
like a
Latinoamérica y el
working group
Caribe, que
chapter
incluye las
for
otras
Latin America and the
subespecies como
Caribbean,
la de
including the other
México,
subspecies, as the one in
y de
Mexico,
Perú,
the
estamos
ones
hay
in
alguien ya que se ha integrado
Chile,
que
Peru. There
está
are some
trabajando
people who have
con o que va a
joined that are
trabajar con
working or
la
that will be
especie, con la
working
lapensis.
with
Entonces
the
estamos
Lapensis species. So
explorando cómo
we
trabajar,
are
cómo nos vamos a
exploring
integrar
how to work,
a
how
este
to
gran grupo de
get
trabajo,
integrated
incluyendo pues
into
todo
this greatest
Latinoamérica y el
large
Caribe.
group,
Entonces,
including
por
Latin
ahorita
America and the Caribbean.
arrancamos 34
So far,
personas
we
de
have
Latinoamérica.
34 people from Latin America.
Son 10 países,
There
son
are
varias
10
organizaciones
countries,
y estamos en ese
many
proceso, poniéndonos de
organizations, and
acuerdo
we're in
cómo
this
vamos a hacer,
process just
entendiendo
getting
dónde
along,
estamos,
reaching
qué
agreements,
necesitamos, en qué
understanding
estamos
where
trabajando
we
ahorita,
are,
cuáles
where we're
son las
headed, what we
brechas en
need, where we're
Latinoamérica para
working, what we're
trabajar la
working
especie.
on, Latin
Bajo
American
esa gran
gaps to work
sombría
with
del
the
grupo de
species
trabajo y
under this
aprender de
big
esos 20 años de experiencia que
work group
traen,
umbrella and
cómo lo
learning from all
agregamos
of these
y
years of
aprendemos y
experience they
aplicamos a
have and
Latinoamérica,
how
¿no?
we
Entonces,
apply them and
básicamente hay
adapt them
muchas
to Latin
necesidades.
America. There are many
Obviamente,
needs, of course.
hemos encontrado, por ejemplo,
We have found,
en
for
Centroamérica
example,
como
in
como
Central
la
America,
guardería de los ostreros.
like
Ahorita en
the
junio hemos empezado a
nursery
ver
of
bebés
the
aniñados o
American
que fueron el
Oscar.
año pasado.
So
Entonces, como los
here we
adolescentes
have
explorando nuevos
seen like
sitios.
the babies
Entonces,
and
creo
their
que hay mucha
adolescents
oportunidad y mucha
exploring new
conexión
places. So there is a
que
lot of
trabajar
opportunity and
y todavía pues
connection
estamos en el
that we
proceso en
can
el
work
camino.
on, and we're still headed on that path. We're on the way.
Sí, muchas gracias, Salvadora. Mucho que
Thank
hacer,
you, Salvadora,
pero tenemos un gran
very
ejemplo
much.
de
There's a
nuestros
lot to do, but we have a
compañeros de
great
este
example
grupo de
from
trabajo.
our
We have
people
another
in this working group.
question here. Maybe will be the last one, from David Ramirez that says, do you think the strong support they have is due to the American Oystercatcher charisma?
I think that's, yeah, it's very helpful. I I would I think it's also very helpful to have a shorebird that is colorful. Just the visual aspect. They are not brown, they are not gray. They don't blend into their background, they stand out. So I think that adds to their charisma, and I think it adds to people actually seeing them and noticing them at the beach. I think another thing that has been helpful is the banding, because when you band a bird, it becomes an individual that people know is that bird. It's not just an oyster catcher, it's that specific oyster catcher. And people can become attached or become interested. They have a history that you can access. And one of the things, if you're a member of the public, when you report an abandoned oyster catcher, you get access to all of its recite records. It's not just the banding record, it's every other reciting. So you can see the story of the oyster catcher. And I think that helps to engage the public as well. When they see animals as individuals, they can, they have more empathy or they have more concern than if it's just, oh, it's a part of a group.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Um, I have one more comment from Salvadora here in the chat that says, regarding the expansion of collaboration in Latin America, we have created a Latin America and the Caribbean subcommittee. We are beginning to identify who is working with the species and where these efforts are taking place across the region. And at the moment, we have participants from 10 Latin American countries representing nearly all of the subspecies. And she put her email at the chat. So if you would like to be part of this initiative, just email her. And well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for this amazing presentation and for sharing with us about all this amazing work that you have been doing with the American Oystercatcher and the American Oystercatcher Working Groups. I'm really glad you could join us today. And please keep joining us, keep the good work. And for everybody, thank you for being here. We will see you at our next webinar. And well, have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lindsay. That was terrific. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you, Laura.